So, hot take, 116 years late, the iceberg didn't kill a single person on the Titanic. I mean, the iceberg, it helped for sure. I'm not an iceberg denier, you know. The iceberg facilitated a lot of the death. It was a net negative. And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying I'm a conspiracy theorist. There was never an iceberg, man. What are you, a shill for big water? But the iceberg is not the why of why most people died that day. Because for over a century, we've called the Titanic like a blanket tragedy. Because a tragedy is a story that's easy to tell. And we totally miss the fact that it could easily have been a story of courage, of people surviving against the odds, much like Dunkirk. Because lifeboats went into the water, right, with 500 empty seats. Because what killed 1,500 people who died on that day wasn't ice. It was a set of decisions and the psychology that made those decisions feel sensible, rational, and right. And that is what this video is about. And why today blaming the economy for poverty is the same as blaming the iceberg, big water, for the tragedy of the Titanic. So there's this fact, right? On the Titanic, a wealthy man in first class had roughly the same chances of getting off alive as a child travelling in third class. Yeah, not the same as a poor man, the same as a child. The ship, the Titanic, was presented with a millionaire in a top hat and a 7-year-old in steerage, that's third class, and it flipped a coin. 97% of first class women survived, 46% of third class women did. Every single child in second class lived. 2 out of 3 children in steerage didn't. Because on the Titanic, society was essentially sorted into decks, because the Titanic, it didn't sink equally, it sank in order of class. It sank in the shape of the world that made it. But we call it a tragedy. Because that word, tragedy, it means random, fate. It means it was nobody's fault. It just happened, like the weather, just happened. But the iceberg, it didn't check anyone's ticket. The iceberg had no idea there were classes on board. In some ways, the iceberg was the most egalitarian thing for 1,000 miles in any direction. It was perfectly happy to sink the lot of them. The iceberg was in it just for the love of the game. Yeah, I just love sinking people, me, you know, like I don't see colour, I don't see class. Third class was actually built furthest from the lifeboats, at the bottom of a maze of corridors that even the crew themselves said took weeks to learn. And there was not a single lifeboat stationed anywhere near the third class passengers. A crowd from third class, apparently on the night, finally made their way up to the boat deck, and they stood there looking at the no lifeboat situation, because the boats had gone. And really bleakly, when you start seeing disasters that way, you really can't stop. Like, take the most beloved story we English tell about ourselves, about grit in the UK, the Blitz spirit. The story of stoic civilians. Keep calm and carry on. London can take it. The bombs fell on everyone. Everyone bore the bombs the same, and everyone mucked in. We absolutely love that story in the UK. We can't get enough of it. We resisted Hitler. Aren't we great? We just plucky little, just resisted bombing. Aren't we great? But the facts are much messier than the newsreels. So the East End, Stepney and Poplar. Stepney was one of London's most heavily bombed boroughs, while Poplar and the surrounding docklands were repeatedly hit. And many families lived in crowded tenements without gardens for private shelters, and early communal shelter provision was absolutely inadequate. The mass observation diaries, which at the time were the government's own project for listening in on the public mood, found morale in those areas frequently on the floor. In fact, the censors took out the panic and the looting and the breakdowns before any of those diaries made it to print. Because again, the tragedy was disproportionately shared. Of course, something real was happening. People did help each other. Communities did hold. And of course, you had the genius of Churchill's speeches, which are absolutely extraordinary, to turn a frightened, exhausted, deeply unequal population into brave defenders of freedom, which is a wonderful thing to be called, and and yeah, an extremely awkward thing to argue with. Because the Blitz spirit wasn't a lie, but what is a lie is that we all suffered equally. Because really the truth is that some people suffered a great deal more. And that's important because most often the people who suffer more don't have a mouthpiece. They don't give speeches. They don't have a voice. And if that sounds like ancient history, here is the identical sentence in a modern suit.
We're all in this together.
George Osborne, 2010. Austerity is a shared sacrifice, delivered to us all by the heir to a luxury soft furnishings empire. Lovely. Beautiful finish on that speech, George. And the data on who actually carried the sacrifice of austerity, well, actually, we can look at that, and it's not up for debate. The poorest lost the biggest share of their income of any other group. The use of food banks rose by something like 2,000% across the decade. Rough sleeping doubled. Disability benefits were cut for the people with the least capacity to absorb that cut. And over the same 10 years, the combined wealth of Britain's richest people roughly doubled. So we're all in the same boat turns out to mean that some of us were in the boat and some of us never actually made it into the boats in the first place. And what's interesting about the wealth tax debate is that the people who call any redistribution of wealth rocking the boat or economic suicide are overwhelmingly the people in the boat in the first place.
Once introduced, a wealth tax won't go away. Inflation will erode thresholds and successive governments will be tempted to widen its scope. We've seen the same happen with inheritance tax.
We all agree that you can only actually tax the better off or the rich. And that's what we all do. And the argument is about how far can you go before the rich say, I'm not playing, I'm not paying. And I think we are at that point.
Capital taxation is bad economically and is essentially used not for growth reasons or for fiscal reasons, but to punish people, class of people that a government doesn't like. The left has always used capital taxation as a means of class warfare.
And this is the question that the whole Titanic tragedy hangs on. You can see who got the lifeboats. That part was never a mystery. It's on the passenger manifest. The real question is the other one. If you are the person in the boat, dry, safe, holding the oar, why on God's green earth would you ever choose to share the boat? Because you're in a boat. You are in a boat. And every time you pull somebody else onto the boat, it rocks the boat. Not even as a metaphor. It rocks the boat. It means taking your dry, safe boat and putting it into danger. No wonder rich people talking about a wealth tax so hysterically are so anxious about it. It feels dangerous to rock the boat. And all the people suffering behind the gates or in the water just look mad and shouty and angry because they're desperate. And their desperation seems dangerous to the safe place that they are. So why? Why would they pull more and more people onto the boats? Because it's dangerous. I'm sorry, but we have to think about the boats. Have you thought about growing your own boat? We just need to grow the boats. You know, like we need investment at some point in the future. For now, though, have you thought of working hard or swimming hard and maybe creating your own boat? You're thinking of boats as a zero sum. You have this idea of zero sum boats. But really, we could have infinite boats. You just don't understand how boats work, do you? You know, just bob at the side until you don't. Thank you. And look at who's chairing the debate about the boats. It's people with boats, because they understand boats. It's the reason why, in our own present day, any talk of a wealth tax gets shot down and so many people come out against it, because all the voices with megaphones and podcasts and positions of power own the boats. And by that I mean half of Britain's newspaper columnists went to private school. 47% of political commentators went to private school. 45%, this is a mad fact, 45% of successful podcasters went to private school. 7%, 7% of the country did. And it's not just the commentators, it's the referees too. Economics, the discipline whose entire job is ruling on what's realistic, turns out to be the least socio-economically diverse academic field there is. 2/3 of American-born economists with PhDs have a parent with a graduate degree. The profession that decides whether poor people can be helped contains almost nobody who has ever been one. So when a wealth tax comes up, notice the tone of the response. It's never, "I'd rather not." It's always that you're an idiot for asking.
It's the magic money tree world, isn't it? And it's the city slogan world. You try governing and you'll find you can't do that.
You're economically naive.
My heart sympathises, my head and my experience tells me that a wealth tax simply won't work. It's emotionally satisfying, but it's economically flawed.
My head knows that it's just sixth form thinking. The world really isn't that simple. The money would simply leave like a startled bird. Yes, they have no money, and I have surplus money, but I can't just give them that money. Yes, my heart says yes, but my brain says, I want the money. No, my brain says it's more complicated than that. And that makes me reassured because I actually want the money. What the people in the water need is growth, more boats. Boats to be built at some unspecified future date, largely by the people currently bailing out the hold with their hats. But what they must never have, under any circumstances, is a seat in this boat. This boat, you see, is full. Well, not with people, it has my stuff in it. And what I find unsettling about all of this, okay, is that none of this requires... That was a boat, wasn't it? But what I find, okay, all aboard. I don't even know what that sound is. That genuinely sounds like a boat. And what I find disturbing about all this, right, is that none of this requires a conspiracy. Nobody has to coordinate the message, because if the columnists, the commentators, the economists, and the lords all grew up on the same deck, they will reach the same conclusions, all independently, and they'll call it a sensible consensus. The deck is the message. Or the message is the deck, however you want to put it. You might be thinking the people on the deck are simply selfish, right? You might hear that and go, aren't they dicks? But actually it's worse than that, and it's actually stranger than that.
Does power corrupt? Does it unleash our problematic tendencies? The answer, regrettably, is it does to all of us in really striking ways. You know, what studies are finding, I'll just give you a couple of highlights from our lab, is, you know, if you give people a little bit of power and experiment, you say, you know, you're in charge and we're paying you more to do this study than those two people over there, right? And I'm like, well, I knew that. I'm kind of a natural leader. If I have a little dose of power, I'm more likely to touch people inappropriately, swear, lie, cheat, steal, shoplift, have sexual affairs. I mean, most of the unethical tendencies come out of feeling too much power.
Datcher Keltner at Berkeley spent 2 decades on this, and the finding was blunt enough that The Atlantic ran it under the headline, "Power Causes Brain Damage." Like, people under the sustained influence of wealth and power begin to behave like someone with a fairly specific head injury. More impulsive, worse at reading risks, and markedly worse at seeing the world from anyone else's point of view. And you can watch this happen live, right? A colleague of his, Sukhvinder Obi, put people in a brain scanner and showed them a video of a hand squeezing a rubber ball. Normally, your brain quietly runs a little copy of that movement inside itself. That's mirroring neurons. More or less, that's the hardware of empathy. But in people primed to feel powerful, that response was dampened, not switched off, but anesthetized. Anesthetized? Anesthetized. I can't say it. Anesthetized. Look at these teeth, I can't say shit. Anesthetized? Because feeling powerful in neurological terms is a bit like getting the dentist to numb that part of your brain that gives a toss about other people. And the catch is that nobody warns you when it's wearing off. So you just keep topping it up. And it gets better. Worse. Keely Muscatel at UCLA found that when high-status people think about somebody else's ordinary day, the empathy networks in the brain barely flicker. And then Paul Piff ran the experiment that ought to be on the national curriculum, where he rigged a game of Monopoly. One player got double the starting money, rolled 2 dice instead of 1, collected twice as much going around the board. And yet that person that had that luck actually believed their strategy is what won their game. If you want to find more about that experiment, you can do in this video here in detail. But it's insane that a man handed a fortune to you by a coin toss and will explain to you that it's just chance will still feel like they earned it. That's not a board game. That's the House of Lords with a tiny metal dog. And the flip side is also from Keltner. The part that I think is most significant is that people with less are consistently better at reading emotions on a face. They're quicker to notice that someone else needs help, and they're more likely to actually give it.
I want to talk about compassion.
Yeah.
It's a word I've struggled to understand, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Because, like, what does it mean? Does it mean being nice to people? What is compassion?
No, compassion is the feeling of concern about other people's suffering, and then taking action, right?
Empathy, is that?
Empathy is, I feel the same thing as you. I understand your mental states. If you're in pain, I feel pain. Compassion is, you're in pain, and I want to make your circumstances better. I want to lift up your well-being. So it's interesting. Compassion is a very dynamic emotion. It's an empowered emotion. And what's striking about it, and I love the neurophysiology of this, and which really speaks to its power, which is that I can see somebody suffering, dying, cancer, flesh wounds, crying, in pain. And when I lock into the compassion response, certain regions of the brain are activated that are different than empathy. The vagus nerve is activated, and it really just throws you into altruistic action.
Which means that the people shouting loudest about the unbearable cost of distributing wealth are, by the evidence, the peer-reviewed evidence, the people least equipped to feel the desperate need to distribute wealth. And that isn't a character flaw, but a wiring one, which means that the argument is tilted before anyone has even opened their mouth. So that's a problem laid out as clearly as I can put it. But now I want to talk about the thing that every so often short-circuits that problem. Because there have been times in the past where wealth has been distributed, right? Where the richer people actually shared. So how has that actually happened? When the richer people actually think, hang on, maybe if I gave this person who has nothing some of my extraordinary wealth, it might help them, and maybe even wider society as a whole. And to show this, I want to reference a famous psychotherapist. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz.
Once I was consulted by an old general practitioner of the outer parts of Vienna, and he told me, Dr. Franke, I come to see you because of a severe depression from which I'm suffering throughout the last 2 years since my wife died. And I can't get rid of this depression. It's nonsense to approach you, doctor, because any prescription I could make myself. But nevertheless, I had the feeling I should speak to you, talk with you. And then there was a pause, and he asked me, what should I do? And I didn't give him any advice. I didn't tell him anything, but I just asked him a question. I asked this old doctor, tell me, doctor, what would have happened if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive?
Had to survive, right.
Thereupon he said, oh, how this would have been terrible. how she had suffered. Thereupon I retorted, well, this suffering, doctor, your wife has been spared this suffering. And it was you who could spare her this suffering. But now, as it were, you have to pay for it. You are billed for it. By the fact that now you have to mourn. You have to suffer. You have to survive her. This man looked me up and then he stood up, gave me his hand, and silently left my office. He found consolation in this reversal of attitude toward a fate which could no longer be changed. I could not revive his wife, you understand?
Right.
But I could change his attitude. Suddenly he saw a meaning, the meaning of a sacrifice. At the same moment, there was no depression any longer. He could overcome this depression. It remained still suffering, but it was suffering for the sake of someone.
When he was in the concentration camps, he watched with his analyst's brain, like very carefully, who lived and who died in those concentration camps. Because it wasn't always obvious. For example, it wasn't always the physically strongest that survived the camps. Often they'd die alongside everybody else. But what seemed to carry people through was whether their suffering had a meaning, a reason. Despair, Viktor Frankl said, is suffering without meaning.
What was besetting the question, the problem which was besetting myself was not as much whether or not I shall survive the camp, but whether or not all these pains, those pains people had to undergo, innocent people had to undergo there, whether all this dying around us has a meaning, an ultimate, a higher meaning or not. For if it had no meaning, I didn't see any meaning even to survive it. I wonder if you understand what
Oh, yes, I do. You're saying survival is not enough, nor even the basic question.
Survival for what?
He watched men in the camp give away their last piece of bread, not because they had given up, but because the act of helping another human being meant something. And that meaning was often the one thing the guards couldn't take from them. And it helped them survive. Those people that found that meaning lived longer in the camps. Somebody with something gave someone without something what they had. And he called it really the last human freedom. Because in life, we really have no control over what happens to us, but we do have the choice of what it will mean. And with that frame, if you look back at the Titanic and the people in the stories that we actually remember, who are they? They're the band that keeps playing. They're the engineers who stayed down below decks to keep the lights running so the other passengers could find their way up to the boats. They're the passengers who handed their life jackets to a stranger. And we don't remember them because they died. We remember them because the sacrifice had meaning. It fit inside a story about who they were and about who we want to be and how we can survive. It meant something. And that is hugely important for society, wealth, and inequality. Suffering that has a meaning can be carried and can actually transform the person carrying it. Suffering with no meaning, the random, structural, invisible kind, just grinds people down. Where there is a meaningful story, people will give up the bread, the jacket, the seat, their wealth. But where there is no frame, no story, they don't sacrifice. So when has a meaningful frame ever actually worked? Are there any examples? When have people at scale chosen to share the boats? Well, recently in South Korea in 1998, the country is on the edge of bankruptcy. It's the Asian financial crisis. So 3.5 million people queue up to hand in their gold. Wedding rings, babies' first birthday rings, sports medals. A cardinal donated the gold cross that he was given when he was made a cardinal. 227 tons of gold, over $2 billion. And nobody forced a single soul. Korea repaid the IMF 3 years early. And post-war Britain belongs on the list too. Like, under all the myth, the genuine surge in people helping each other, it was real. And it bled actually into the welfare state. Post-war as well. Like, during the war, the rich paid 93% taxes. And after the war, that stayed until pretty much the 1980s. And why? There was a mission to rebuild Britain, rebuild the country. It was a unifying story. And the thread running through all of this is the same. The sacrifice was chosen, not forced. The story was clear. This is what saving the thing we love looks like. And there's also a hopeful thing that comes from Piff and Keltner's research. So they found that a brief experience of awe, standing under something vast, a cathedral, a sky full of stars, standing in a forest, measurably shrinks the self. People come out of that experience less entitled and more generous, at least for a while.
The great philosopher Protagoras, as is customary in a lot of philosophical traditions, tells this origin story about the human species. And what he writes about in this Greek period is, when he took stock of the human species, he noted, we're not a particularly strong species compared to other animals. We're not very fast. We're not fleet of foot. We don't have giant canines like other mammals. What is it that defines human beings in terms of our sort of signature strength? And what Protagoras argued is that it really is our capacity for awe. It is our ability to revere things, to treat things as sacred and beyond economic calculations or the like. So the first idea is that awe, very simply put, helps us fold into social collectives, right? We are a hypersocial species. E.O. Wilson, the great biologist, made the case that this is our defining attribute as a species, is to form communities and political bodies and neighborhoods and to have contagious experiences. We are a collective species, and you'll see evidence here and there that shows that awe does this amazing transformation of shifting us out of self-interest to being really interested in other people. This is one of the great challenges for humans in our momentary lives, and also in the context of our evolution, thinking about what we are as a social species, is to move out of a model of self-interest and sort of gratifying your own desires, which is very important evolutionarily, and then integrating into your action the interests of other people in your social collective. We do that better than almost any species on the face of the earth. We have big parts of the frontal lobes that help us think about the interests of other people, integrate them into courses of action. And what we're finding is brief doses of awe, as I'm about to show you, going out in the woods, which Stacey Baer studies, move us from a model of self-interest to really being engaged in the interests of others. And that's why Jason suggested that awe may be a counterpoint to the narcissism and abuses of power we're worried about.
People come out of that experience less entitled and more generous. For a while, the Monopoly winner can be reminded that they're only playing a game. Because the old woman in Seoul who handed in her wedding ring wasn't a mug, and she wasn't brainwashed. She had a story, a frame. The country she'd survived an occupation and a war to build was in danger. And this is what saving it looked like. That was enough. So here, at the end, is how not to be fooled. When you hear people shouting that redistribution is madness, economic suicide, the end of civilization, don't mistake it for analysis. It's fear. It is people who can feel with absolute clarity the loss of some of what they have, wired to brains that can no longer feel what it is to have nothing left to lose at all. The fight is not to drag anyone out of the boats and fling them in the water. The fight is for the story. The frame that lets a hungry man hand over his bread to a starving man. The story that put 3.5 million people in a queue with their wedding rings, or the story that for one strange moment, under a big enough sky, lets even the man who won the rigged game remember it was a game. I'm talking about a different game here. The fight is for a story big, real, and urgent enough that filling every single seat on those boats feels like who we are. We can turn a tragedy into a story of survival and courage instead of arguing about the luggage, because who we are is people who get as many people into the lifeboats as possible.
We cannot find ourselves, our identity, except by devoting, committing ourselves to something or someone. We cannot struggle for self-actualization except through the detour of devoting ourselves to a cause, to the world, around the way guides us around the world, and not by direct intention of ourselves. By committing to a cause higher than himself, by dedicating to a person whom he loves. Spiritual aspects and aspirations of man are not primarily intellectual issues, but primarily a matter of one's personal conscience, of the innermost decision, a matter of love, of dedication, of commitment. This is human spirit.